Now perhaps you've already read a good deal about realism. You know things, some of the basic assumptions about realism at this point. Things like leaders are motivated by rational self-interest, power is defined as political authority, leaders are going to try to maintain a balance of power, or if you're talking about structural realism, the structure of the international system, that is, where all the power exists in the system, is going to determine how it is that states are going to behave. Well, what I'm going to talk about is sort of the next logical implication of this, and that is something called the balance of power theory. Now, in order to understand this, you have to first of all understand that there can be basically three or more different structures of the international system. One way is to say that a state is unipolar, that is to say that there is one major power that dominates the international system. Another one is to say that it's bipolar, that there are two major powers in the international system dominating all the others. Tripolar, of course, means three. You can also say multipolar, which means, three or more. And what realists argue is that a balance is essentially the most stable system, or at least a lot of realists argue that that's true. So let's have a look and see sort of how a balance of power scenario might play out. Now, as you can see, we have some armies laid out here on the table. Let's move some things around. You have three sets of armies here, and all are relatively equal in power. What is the incentive that any one of these armies is likely to attack each other? The answer is, of course, according to realists, probably not very much, because at this point, because they're all relatively equal in power, there's a balance of power, of course. Now let's say that you take away some of these armies and set yourself up in a situation like this. Which of the armies is going to be exploited at this point? The answer, of course, is going to be the relatively smaller army, not, of course, the two larger ones. Now, there are a number of ways in which we could possibly play out an invasion scenario in this case. This army decides that it wants to attack this army. Would it be in this army's self-interest to come around then and get involved in this fight? Well, it depends. It might be wise for it to sit out, because even though this army is more dominant, perhaps if this one is able to take out some, little by little, bit by bit, by the time the conflict is all over, you might end up with an army that is relatively smaller, and then perhaps easier for this army to come in and dominate the entire system. We may be seeing a situation somewhat like that in Iraq nowadays, or certainly a lot of people argue, where you have an army that's essentially this large, that's attacking some insurgents that are essentially this big, and what's happening is that they're losing, sort of relatively speaking, about that much, and we are, in terms of resources and expenditures, gradually weighting ourselves down. Another possible way to look at this is to consider the fact that we may be fighting a two-front war. We have Iraq and Afghanistan, and of course commitments all throughout the world. Some would argue that maybe there's a similarity with the Nazi Germany attacking both their eastern and western fronts, Napoleon doing the same. Historically speaking, this has never been a strategy that's been extremely effective as far as keeping your forces concentrated. So that's one way, anyway, to look at it. It's not the only way to look at it, but that certainly is one implication in terms of balance of power theory. The sort of scenario that you had in the Cold War was a bipolar scenario. That is one where you had the Soviet Union and the United States essentially side by side, relatively, maybe not perfectly in equal power, but certainly they perceived that they were equals, and they treated each other as equals. Therefore, they certainly maintained that there was a balance of power, and that decreased the likelihood that they were going to attack each other as well. The fact that they had nuclear weapons also might have played a role in this, in addition to that. Now, one thing you might also consider is that sometimes a balance of power isn't always what people desire. Again, let's introduce our tiny little army for a second and see what might happen in this scenario. Let's say the United States, let's say this is Iraq and this is the United States, and the year isn't 2002, 2003, but now it's about 1990-91. The United States believes there's an interest in taking out Iraq. So what do? They go to, let's say these are other scattered powers maybe, right? They decide they want to invade Iraq, And through negotiation, they essentially get the other parties to do something that's not called balancing, it's called bandwagoning. And that essentially means that everybody is going to get together and gang up on the little guy, and maybe there's some sort of interest in that. Well, what might be the interest? Maybe the fact is that you leave this guy weaker, less likely to screw up the system that the larger powers are enjoying at this point. Maybe the larger powers can split up the resources to some extent. So there are all sorts of ways in which this can play out, and it doesn't necessarily always follow a perfect balance of power framework. Here's another scenario to think about. Let's say that you have two armies here, and let's take a few away. Let's say that this one is relatively smaller. They are probably not weak enough at this point to be completely overcome by these guys. And so what are they going to want to do? Well, the answer is they're probably going to want to build themselves up so that they can protect themselves against this power, just in case this power decides to get aggressive and take them over. This power, on the other hand, might also perceive that these guys are wanting to do that, and so what are they going to do? They're going to do exactly the same thing. This is called a security dilemma. As each power tries to increase itself, relatively speaking, it ends up leaving the entire system absolutely insecure. And so we have an arms race where more and more armies are added to both sides. And according to realists, this can lead to a very unstable system.